He was the richest man of his time, the most generous American philanthropist to this day, a ruthless union-busting robber baron, and an ardent advocate for international peace.
Andrew Carnegie came to America as a penniless Scottish boy clutching borrowed books and rose to become the richest man on the planet. In 1901, he sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, about $17 billion today, more wealth than any private citizen had ever held. His rails carried trains to the western frontier. His beams pushed the first American skyscrapers into the clouds. But what price was paid for that progress? How did the same empire that built a modern nation also crush unions, spark bloody strikes, and stand at the center of one of the deadliest labor battles in U.S. history? Richer than a young Rockefeller, yet more feared by his own steelworkers. Carnegie embodied the double-edged sword of the Gilded Age progress for the nation, pain for the people who built it. This is the paradox of Andrew Carnegie, the immigrant who forged America in steel, then tried to redeem it in philanthropy. He was born on November 25, 1835, the eldest son of William Carnegie, a skilled handloom weaver who produced fine damask linen. In those first years, the family lived modestly but comfortably enough to move into a larger stone house in 1836. That brief stability vanished almost overnight. The Industrial Revolution swept through Britain like a tidal wave. Steam-powered looms churned out cloth faster and cheaper than any artisan could. William's craft, once his pride and livelihood, became obsolete. And the Carnegies slid from lower middle-class respectability into debt and hunger. Young Andrew watched his father dismantle the family loom to sell the wood for cash. That humiliation left a scar to Andrew. It was proof that technology can destroy the unprepared, so better to control the change than be its victim. In 1848, the Carnegies emigrated to Allegheny City, Pennsylvania, squeezing into a two-room tenement above a weaver's shop. 13-year-old Andrew worked 12-hour days as a cotton mill bobbin boy for $1.20 a week, racing spools to feed the machines. A telegraph messenger job changed his path, curious about the clicking code. He taught himself Morse by ear, soon becoming an operator and earning access to Colonel James Anderson's free library for working boys, a resource he later credited as the spark for his passion for libraries. At 18, he became secretary telegraph operator to Thomas A. Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad, learning to cut costs, move freight faster, and spot new growth corridors. By his mid-20s, he was Scott's trusted lieutenant, even running troop trains during the Civil War. Carnegie invested his savings in the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company. Then, in Keystone Bridge 1865, his gateway to iron bridges and, soon, steel rails. When the Civil War ended in 1865, America was hungry for iron bridges, new railroads, and the cities rising in their wake. Carnegie, already a seasoned railroad insider with capital from his sleeping car investment, saw the nation's next great building phase. That same year, he founded the Keystone Bridge Company, betting that iron trusses would replace brittle wooden spans. The gamble paid off. But iron was just the opening act. By the early 1870s, British engineer Henry Bessemer's process could turn molten iron into steel cheaply, quickly, and strong enough to carry locomotives and skyscrapers. Carnegie grasped its potential at once. In 1875, he opened the Edgar Thomson Steelworks outside Pittsburgh, named for a powerful railroad baron to secure lucrative contracts. With Bessemer converters roaring day and night, rail steel prices fell from about $100 a ton to under $20, allowing Carnegie to underbid British suppliers and flood the American market. The results were staggering. Carnegie Steel's output leapt from 332,000 tons of rails in 1889 to over 2.6 million in 1899, while annual profits soared from $2 million to more than $40 million. To protect margins, Carnegie built a self-contained empire iron ore mines on Minnesota's Mesabi Range, coal fields and coke ovens in Pennsylvania, ore-carrying steamships on the Great Lakes, and even his own rail lines to feed the furnaces, cutting transport costs by half in today's terms. It was as if a tech giant controlled every chip, screen, and shipping lane for its flagship product. Inside the mills, he enforced relentless efficiency. Watch the costs and the profits will take care of themselves. Managers were rewarded for shaving pennies off production and told to replace machinery the moment it lagged behind. That culture of constant reinvestment kept his plants at the forefront of global steelmaking. Carnegie's power showed in headline ventures. The Edgar Thomson Works pioneered large-scale Bessemer rail steel. The Duquesne Works, acquired in 1890 after Carnegie allegedly spread rumors to drive down its price, introduced state-of-the-art open hearth furnaces that set new industry standards. The masterstroke came in 1901 when he sold his entire steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, about $17 billion today, creating U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation, which soon controlled 60% of America's steel output and a quarter of the world's. His timing was impeccable. He expanded during the railroad boom and bought distressed assets during financial panics such as 1873. Carnegie's rails bound the continent, and his beams soon rose as the skeletons of New York and Chicago's first skyscrapers. Yet the same obsession with cutting costs hardened conditions in his mill's 12-hour shifts, 7-day weeks, and dangerous furnaces with few safety rules, planting the seeds of the labor battles that would later tarnish his legacy. For now, in the confident 1890s, the former bobbin boy presided over an industrial machine so vast Its rails and girders literally reshaped America, from wooden bridges to Bessemer furnaces, from a one-room telegraph office to the largest corporate merger in history. Carnegie's empire was built on vision, timing, and his conviction that whoever controlled every link of production controlled his destiny. By the dawn of the 1890s, Andrew Carnegie's empire was no longer just feeding Pennsylvania's railroads. From the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh, his reach now stretched across oceans, powering industries and reshaping cities thousands of miles away. What began as a regional mill had evolved into a global industrial force, and Carnegie himself into one of the most influential men of the age. Steel was his passport to power. His rails bound the American Midwest, South, and West into a single national economy, carrying settlers, timber, coal, the raw lifeblood of expansion. Carnegie Steel exported bridge girders to Canada, rails to India's colonial railways, and structural beams to Europe's rising skylines. A bar of steel cast in the Edgar Thomson Works could end up under the Brooklyn Bridge roadway, in the ribs of a Chicago skyscraper, or in the tracks of a South American railway, for a time. Carnegie's furnaces did not just supply the world's infrastructure, they dictated the very rhythm of global modernity. Carnegie also understood that industrial power meant little without political sway. His early service under Thomas A. Scott during the Civil War had shown him how railroads and steel fortunes rose and fell with government contracts. By the late 19th century, Carnegie quietly cultivated allies in Congress, influenced tariff debates, and championed free trade to keep raw materials cheap and export markets open. His famous 1889 essay, The Gospel of Wealth, read as both a philanthropic credo and a declaration that industrial leaders like himself had earned the moral right to guide society's progress. Behind the scenes, his influence was decisive. Federal contracts for the Navy's new steel-hulled fleet, for urban transit lines, and for bridges routinely drew on Carnegie's mills. Cities seeking waterworks or civic buildings often negotiated directly with his salesmen. Through philanthropy, he exercised a softer but equally strategic form of power, offering libraries, music halls, and educational grants to towns that also needed his steel-blending civic generosity with corporate advantage. In an age of champagne-soaked galas, Carnegie preferred books, Scottish ballads, and quiet strategy. Yet, he moved easily in the world's most exclusive circles. He advised governments on industrial exhibitions and peace conferences, sat with British Prime Minister William Gladstone and U.S. President William McKinley, and in 1902 founded the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington, hoping to shape knowledge as he had shaped industry. His steel, meanwhile, was visible everywhere in the latticework of the Brooklyn Bridge, in the riveted skeletons of Chicago's and New York's first skyscrapers, in the transit bridges and tunnels that knit modern cities together. To ordinary Americans, these were monuments to progress. To Carnegie, they were proof of his command over the nation's physical future. Critics warned that so much influence concentrated in one man's hands could tilt markets, steer public policy, and dictate the pace of urban development. His gifts, more than 2,000 public libraries and the celebrated Carnegie Hall, were praised as visionary, yet sometimes dismissed as a shrewd effort to polish the image of a ruthless monopolist. Still, his dominion was undeniable. From the Mesabi iron fields to the Liverpool docks, from the reading rooms of small-town America to the gilded halls of European academies, the Carnegie name became synonymous with industrial progress and cultural patronage. By the close of the century, Andrew Carnegie was no longer merely a steelmaker. He was a kingmaker, a man whose wealth could move economies, whose steel could shape skylines, and whose influence could steer both the policies of governments and the imaginations of entire cities. For all the grandeur of Andrew Carnegie's empire, its story cannot be told without the shadows cast by his power. The very scale that let him command railroads, steel markets, and even the ear of Congress also magnified every misstep, turning accidents and labor disputes into national reckonings. The first crack in his image came not inside a mill, but in the hills outside Pittsburgh. In 1889, the South Fork Dam burst after heavy rains, sending a wall of water down the valley that obliterated Johnstown and killed more than 2,200 people. The dam belonged to the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club, a private resort for Pittsburgh's elite industrialists, including Henry Clay Frick and Carnegie himself. Engineers had long warned that the dam's crest had been lowered for the club's carriages and that a fish screen clogged the spillway, but the warnings were ignored. Legally, the disaster was ruled an act of God. And Carnegie, in New York at the time, faced no charges. Yet the outrage was intense. The flood came to symbolize the arrogance of the Gilded Age, the wealthy enjoying their private lake while working families in the valley below paid with their lives. Carnegie's $10,000 donation to the relief fund and the library he later built in Johnstown were welcomed by survivors, but widely seen as efforts to wash away a stain on his name. The incident revealed a new kind of power imbalance. Even nature's fury seemed worsened by the decisions of men who controlled both the dam and the destiny of the region. 3 years later, that imbalance turned deadly inside the mills. At Homestead in 1892, Frick, now Carnegie's top lieutenant, slashed wages by nearly 20% despite booming profits. Carnegie, on vacation in Scotland, granted him full authority. Frick fortified the plant behind barbed wire Fort Frick walls and called in 300 Pinkerton agents to break the strike. Gunfire erupted along the Monongahela River, leaving 7 steelworkers and 3 Pinkertons dead. From abroad, Carnegie cabled, "We approve everything you do. Never employ one of these riders again." Those words, coming from the richest industrialist in America, were taken as proof that his immense economic power translated into the power to decide whose labor and lives were expendable. The fallout was severe. Homestead became a national emblem of industrial brutality, exposing the human cost behind Carnegie's obsession with cutting costs and upgrading machines. Editorial cartoons mocked the contradiction, one hand penning essays on philanthropy, the other signing off on union busting. Labor leaders cited Homestead as evidence that the gospel of wealth was less moral code than public relations shield. Even within the boardroom, Carnegie's dominance bred conflict. His rift with Frick, once his indispensable partner, erupted after Homestead over expansion costs and control of the company. In 1899, Carnegie invoked an ironclad agreement to buy out Frick's shares at book value, far below market price. Frick sued, threatening to reveal company ledgers rumored to show secret profits approaching $40 million a year, a disclosure that could have sparked public outrage and government action against the steel giants. To keep the books closed, Carnegie paid a private settlement exceeding $30 million. Their personal feud spilled into Pittsburgh's skyline. Frick erected his own office tower just a few feet taller than the neighboring Carnegie building, a stone and steel reminder of their war for supremacy. As criticism mounted, reformers grouped Carnegie with Rockefeller and Vanderbilt under the label robber barons, arguing that his monopoly power and relentless cost-cutting sacrificed workers for profit. The Johnstown flood and Homestead strike became set pieces in the debate over whether unchecked industrial power was endangering the nation. The paradox deepened. Carnegie funded thousands of public libraries, universities, and cultural landmarks. Yet these gifts were often seen as blood-stained benevolence, the gilding of fortunes built on 12-hour shifts, broken strikes, and burned-out families. By the century's end, Carnegie remained one of the richest and most influential private citizens on Earth. But public opinion had shifted. His story had evolved from the triumphant immigrant's rise to a cautionary tale about what happens when a single man's power can build a nation's skyline while deepening the rift between wealth and work. The very ruthlessness that made him king of steel had also become the source of the scandals that tarnished his crown proof, that in the Gilded Age. Power and controversy were forged from the same molten steel. When Andrew Carnegie sold his steel empire to J.P. Morgan in 1901, he walked away from the furnaces with a personal fortune of roughly $350 million more money than any private citizen had ever controlled. Yet, he often declared that the man who dies rich dies disgraced, and in his final 2 decades, he set out to give that fortune away. Carnegie had only one child, a daughter named Margaret, and deliberately rejected the dynastic path of the Rockefellers or Vanderbilts. His heirs, he insisted, would be institutions, not descendants. From 1901 until his death in 1919, he reinvented himself as the most ambitious philanthropist of his era. He funded more than 2,800 public libraries worldwide, about 1,700 in the United States, convinced that free access to books was the surest ladder out of poverty, just as Colonel Anderson's library had been for him as a boy. He founded the Carnegie Institution for Science in Washington to push the frontiers of research, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to promote diplomacy after the carnage of industrial warfare, and the Carnegie Hero Fund to honor ordinary people who risked their lives to save others. In Pittsburgh, he left behind cultural landmarks that still define the city: Carnegie Hall, the Museum of Natural History, and the Carnegie Technical Schools, later Carnegie Mellon University. Altogether, he gave away over $350 million, more than 90% of his wealth, a sum that would equal billions today. His philanthropy was strategic rather than charitable. Instead of handing out cash relief, he built institutions designed to be self-sustaining. A town that wanted a Carnegie library had to provide the land, stock the books, and pledge to maintain it. "I give the tools," he argued. "The community must use them." Critics then and now called this approach paternalistic, saying it let Carnegie dictate the moral and educational priorities of the towns he endowed. Supporters countered that he pioneered a model of venture-style philanthropy that inspired future billionaires, from John D. Rockefeller to Bill Gates, to link private wealth with public purpose. Carnegie died in Lenox, Massachusetts, in 1919 at the age of 83. The industrial empire he built lived on as part of U.S. Steel, but the name Carnegie increasingly became associated with culture, science, and education rather than furnaces and strikes. Across North America and Britain, modest brickfront libraries still carry his carved name above the door, and his foundations continue to fund research, scholarship programs, peace initiatives, and public policy studies. His legacy remains two-sided. The steel he produced laid the bones of modern cities, and his philanthropic network has uplifted generations through knowledge and art. Yet the brutal labor battles and environmental scars of his mills remind us that these civic gifts were forged from an industrial system that left many workers broken or unheard. A century after his death, Andrew Carnegie's influence still lingers in the skylines he built and the libraries he endowed, proof that one immigrant's vision can outlive the empire that made him rich and the controversies that shadowed his name. For over half a century, Andrew Carnegie helped shape America's rise in steel, stone, and ideals. He arrived a poor Scottish boy, taught himself by borrowed books, and built an empire that laid the rails of a growing nation and the steel bones of its skyline. Yet the man who funded libraries for millions also crushed strikes and oversaw brutal mill conditions that cost lives. Carnegie remains a paradox, a champion of self-education who denied his workers the dignity he prized, a visionary builder whose philanthropy uplifted generations, but whose drive for efficiency scarred labor and the land. His words, "The man who dies rich dies," disgrace still echo in debates over whether today's billionaires can truly balance profit with responsibility. More than a century later, his name endures on libraries, universities, bridges, and skyscrapers, along with the questions he left behind. Was his ruthlessness the price of progress? Or a failure of conscience that progress never required? Was Andrew Carnegie a visionary builder or a robber baron hiding behind philanthropy? Share your thoughts below and stay tuned for our next episode on the Rockefellers and the oil empire that shaped a new century.